The streetlights cast long shadows across the quiet suburban roads as Michelle drove home from another late-night community meeting. As a single mom and dedicated youth center coordinator, her days often stretched well into the evening, but she didn't mind. The work she did helping local teens find their path meant everything to her. The meeting had gone exceptionally well. They'd finally secured funding for their summer mentorship program, something the neighborhood desperately needed. Michelle couldn't help smiling as she thought about all the young faces who would benefit from this initiative. Her own kids were probably already asleep at their grandmother's house, but she couldn't wait to tell them about it in the morning. The familiar streets were almost empty at this hour. She hummed along to the soft R&B playing on her car radio, her mind wandering to tomorrow's to-do list. The dashboard clock read 9:45 p.m., still enough time to review some paperwork before bed. She'd learned to make every minute count, especially since taking on the leadership role at the center 3 years ago. As she turned onto Maple Avenue, just 2 blocks from home, the flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror cut through her thoughts. Michelle's heart skipped a beat, though she knew she hadn't done anything wrong. She'd been driving exactly the speed limit, her taillight had just been checked last week, and her registration was up to date. Taking a deep breath, she did exactly what she'd always taught the teens at her workshops about police interactions. Stay calm. Be methodical. Document everything. She carefully pulled over to the right, positioning her car under a streetlight. Her hands moved steadily as she turned off the radio, switched on the interior light, and placed both hands visible on the steering wheel. The cruiser parked behind her, its lights still flashing, illuminating her car in alternating red and blue. Michelle glanced at her phone, making sure the dashboard camera app she'd installed was running. It was a small investment she'd made after hearing too many troubling stories from community members. Better safe than sorry, her brother, a civil rights attorney, had always said. Through her side mirror, she watched the police officer step out of their vehicle. Something about their body language made her uneasy, the aggressive stance, the way they slammed their car door. Still, Michelle kept her breathing steady. She had nothing to hide and knew her rights. Her window was already rolled down halfway, enough to communicate clearly while maintaining a sense of security. The registration and insurance documents were waiting in the glove compartment, but she knew better than to reach for them before being asked. Years of community organizing had taught her the importance of every small detail in situations like these. The distant sound of crickets and the soft hum of the engine filled the tense moment as the officer approached. Michelle's mind briefly flashed to her kids, to the hundreds of young people she mentored, to all the conversations she'd had about maintaining dignity in the face of injustice. Little did she know, this routine traffic stop was about to become anything but routine. The whole scene felt surreal. The empty street, the flickering streetlight above, the approaching footsteps. Michelle's calm exterior masked the rapid thoughts running through her mind. She'd spent years teaching others how to handle situations like this, and now she was about to put those lessons to the test. The irony wasn't lost on her that just hours ago, she'd been discussing community police relations at the youth center. The weight of her cell phone in her pocket provided a small measure of comfort. So did the knowledge that her dashboard camera was silently recording everything. These modern tools had become necessary allies in the ongoing struggle for accountability and justice. As the officer's flashlight beam swept across her rearview mirror, Michelle steeled herself for whatever was about to unfold. The beam of the officer's flashlight swept through Michelle's car, lingering unnecessarily long on her face. She kept her hands steady on the steering wheel, maintaining her composure despite the growing tension in the air. Through her side mirror, she could see Officer Reynolds, his name badge clearly visible under the streetlight, approaching with an unmistakable aggression in his stride. "License and registration," he barked, not even bothering with the customary greeting. His tone was sharp enough to cut through the quiet night air. Michelle noticed his hand already resting on his belt, but she'd given him no reason for such alertness. "Good evening, officer," she replied calmly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "May I ask why I've been pulled over?" It was a reasonable question, one that any driver had the right to ask. But Officer Reynolds' reaction suggested he thought otherwise. "I said, license and registration," he repeated, his voice rising. "Or are you having trouble understanding simple English?" The thinly veiled contempt in his words hung heavy in the air between them. Michelle kept her voice level, drawing on years of experience in difficult conversations. "I understand perfectly, officer. I'd just like to know the reason for the stop. Then I'll gladly provide my documents." She could feel her pulse quickening but maintained her professional demeanor, the same one she used during tense community board meetings. The officer's face twisted into a scowl. "You people always want to make things difficult, don't you?" His words carried the weight of countless similar confrontations, countless similar prejudices. "Step out of the vehicle, now." Michelle's mind raced, but her movements remained deliberate and calm. "Officer, I don't believe I'm legally required to exit my vehicle for a routine traffic stop. If you could please just tell me." She didn't get to finish her sentence. Officer Reynolds yanked her car door open with such force that the whole vehicle shook. The sudden blast of cool night air rushed in, along with the overwhelming presence of an angry man in uniform looming over her. "I said get out." His voice had risen to a shout now, echoing off the empty streets. "You want to play lawyer? We can play lawyer down at the station." His hand was no longer just resting on his belt, it was gripping his handcuffs. Michelle fought to keep her breathing steady, acutely aware of her dashboard camera still recording. Every word, every action, every abuse of power was being documented. She thought of her children, of her community, of all the times she counseled young people about staying calm in these situations. "Officer Reynolds," she said, using his name deliberately, her voice clear and controlled. "I want to cooperate, but I also have rights. You haven't told me why you've pulled me over, and now you're escalating this situation without cause. I'm going to remain in my vehicle unless you can provide a lawful reason for me to exit." The officer's face reddened with rage. His next words came through clenched teeth. "Last warning. Get out of the car, or I'm adding resisting arrest to your charges." He stepped closer, using his bulk to cast an intimidating shadow over her. Michelle's hand instinctively touched her pocket where her phone rested, its emergency contact screen just a few taps away. Her brother's legal advice echoed in her mind. "Document everything, stay calm, but stand your ground when you're right." The silence between them crackled with tension. In the distance, a dog barked, reminding her that this seemingly isolated moment was taking place in a real neighborhood where real people lived, people who might be watching, recording, bearing witness to whatever happened next. Officer Reynolds' body camera light blinked red in the darkness, but his hand was already reaching for her arm. Michelle knew the next few moments would be crucial. Everything she taught others about maintaining dignity while asserting rights was about to be put to the ultimate test. She could hear cars passing on the main road a block away, their headlights occasionally sweeping across the scene like searchlights. Each passing vehicle represented potential witnesses, potential help, potential documentation of whatever was about to unfold. The dashboard camera continued its silent vigil, capturing every second of this escalating confrontation. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who'd ever faced similar treatment, every workshop she'd led about knowing your rights, every young person who looked up to her as an example of standing up to injustice with dignity. As Officer Reynolds' grip tightened on her car door, Michelle steeled herself for what would come next. Time seemed to slow down as Officer Reynolds forcefully pulled Michelle from her vehicle. The cool night air hit her face, but she remained focused on staying composed. Her mind flashed back to 3 months ago when she'd installed the dashboard camera, a decision that now felt like destiny rather than precaution. She remembered that Saturday afternoon clearly. She'd been sitting at her kitchen table, reading yet another news story about a traffic stop gone wrong. Her brother, the civil rights lawyer, had dropped by with the dashboard camera in hand. "It's not just about protecting yourself," he'd said while helping her install it. "It's about truth. About making sure your story gets told the right way." Now, as Officer Reynolds roughly guided her toward his patrol car, that small black lens was capturing everything. The way he twisted her arm despite her compliance. The string of degrading comments he made under his breath. The complete absence of any legitimate reason for the stop. Every detail was being recorded in crystal clear quality, creating an undeniable record of what was really happening on this quiet suburban street. "Spread your legs." "Hands on the hood," Officer Reynolds commanded, pushing her against his patrol car. Michelle complied, her cheek pressed against the cold metal. She could feel the heat of the engine through her palms, still warm from its recent patrol. The cruiser's flashing lights created a disorienting strobe effect, painting the scene in alternating red and blue. But even in this vulnerable position, Michelle knew she wasn't powerless. The dashboard camera wasn't her only backup plan. Her phone, still in her pocket, was running a live streaming app. Another piece of advice from her brother. Every second was being uploaded directly to a secure cloud server where it couldn't be deleted or altered. As Officer Reynolds patted her down with unnecessary roughness, Michelle thought about all the community meetings she'd attended where people shared similar stories. How many times had she sat across from someone describing this exact scenario? How many times had she wished there was concrete evidence to support their claims? Now she had that evidence. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Officer Reynolds sneered, clearly frustrated by her continued composure. "Think having a fancy car and nice clothes means you can disrespect an officer." His words carried the weight of old prejudices, but his voice betrayed something else. Uncertainty. Something about Michelle's calm demeanor seemed to unsettle him. She remained silent, focusing on her breathing. In through her nose, out through her mouth, just like she taught the youth in her conflict resolution workshops. Every hostile word from the officer, every unnecessary push and shove, was being documented. His body camera might conveniently malfunction later, but her footage would tell the true story. The distant sound of another car approaching made Officer Reynolds pause. Michelle could see the vehicle slowing down through the reflection in his cruiser's window. More witnesses, more potential documentation. The officer's grip on her arm loosened slightly as the car passed by at a crawl, its occupants clearly watching the scene unfold. Her thoughts drifted to the dozens of flash drives her brother had helped her prepare, each one containing copies of Know Your Rights information and documentation strategies. They distributed them at community events, sometimes to skeptical audiences. It seems excessive, people would say. Paranoid even. But now, as she stood against the police cruiser with her rights being violated, she understood the true value of being prepared. The dashboard camera kept rolling as Officer Reynolds ran her license, each minute adding to the record of his misconduct. She could almost picture the footage. Clear, undeniable evidence of a routine traffic stop transformed into a display of prejudice and power abuse. This wouldn't be a case of her word against his. The truth was being captured in high definition. A light drizzle began to fall, creating halos around the streetlights. Michelle felt each cool drop on her skin, grounding her in the reality of the moment. She thought about how this footage would be used, not just for her case, but as a teaching tool. A real-world example of why documentation matters, why preparation matters, why keeping your composure matters. Through the patrol car's window, she could see her own car, its interior lights still glowing softly. The dashboard camera's small red recording light blinked steadily, like a tiny beacon of hope. Officer Reynolds might control this moment, but he couldn't control the narrative. Not anymore. Technology had leveled the playing field, giving voice to the voiceless and eyes to the overlooked. As the officer continued running her information, probably searching for any excuse to justify his behavior, Michelle allowed herself a small, internal smile. He had no idea that his every action was being preserved, every word recorded, every abuse of power documented for the world to see. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a badge or a gun, it's the simple, unblinking eye of a camera lens, telling truths that can't be denied. The morning after the incident, Michelle sat in the police department's waiting room, her hands clasped tightly around a manila folder containing her complaint forms. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the institutional beige walls. She'd been waiting for nearly 2 hours, watching other people come and go while the desk sergeant repeatedly told her to just wait a bit longer. Her brother, the civil rights attorney, had helped her prepare everything the night before. They'd stayed up until 3 a.m., downloading footage from both her dashboard camera and phone, making multiple copies, and carefully documenting every detail while it was still fresh in her mind. "They're going to try to weigh you down," he'd warned. "But we've got something they're not expecting, solid proof." Finally, a Lieutenant Chen called her into his office. His desk was cluttered with papers and coffee cups, family photos lined up neatly along one edge. He barely looked up as she entered, gesturing vaguely toward an uncomfortable plastic chair. "So you want to file a complaint about Officer Reynolds," he said, not really asking a question. His tone suggested he'd heard it all before. "You know, these things are very serious. Making false accusations against an officer is a crime." Michelle placed her folder on his desk, her voice steady. "I understand completely, Lieutenant. That's why I brought evidence." She pulled out the first set of documents, screenshots from her dashboard camera footage, carefully time-stamped and annotated. The lieutenant's expression shifted slightly as he flipped through the photos. "Well, these could be taken out of context," he said, but there was a new uncertainty in his voice. "Officer Reynolds is a decorated member of our force. He's been serving this community for 15 years. "I have the full video," Michelle replied calmly, placing a USB drive on his desk. "Unedited from multiple angles. I also have the names of witnesses who stopped to record the incident on their phones." She'd collected their contact information right after Officer Reynolds had finally let her go, her hands still shaking but her mind focused on gathering evidence. Lieutenant Chen leaned back in his chair, studying her with new interest. "You seem very prepared for this." There was a hint of accusation in his words, as if being prepared somehow made her less credible. "I'm prepared because I have to be," Michelle responded, thinking of all the community meetings where people shared similar stories, stories that were dismissed because they lacked documentation. "I'm prepared because this isn't just about me. It's about making sure our community can trust the people who are supposed to protect us." The lieutenant's phone rang, giving him an excuse to pause the conversation. Michelle used the moment to send a quick text to her brother, meeting with Lieutenant Chen now, following the plan. They'd anticipated every possible response, prepared for every attempt to discourage her. When Lieutenant Chen hung up, his approach changed. "Look, maybe we can handle this informally," he suggested, his tone suddenly more conciliatory. "I can talk to Officer Reynolds, make sure he understands the importance of professional conduct." Michelle thought about how easy it would be to accept this offer, to just walk away and try to forget the whole thing. But then she remembered the youth center teens who looked up to her, who counted on her to show them that standing up for justice was worth the fight. "I appreciate the offer, Lieutenant," she said, pulling out another document from her folder. "But I need to file this complaint formally. And I should mention that my attorney has already submitted copies of all this evidence to the Civilian Oversight Board and the State Attorney General's office." The change in Lieutenant Chen's demeanor was immediate. He sat up straighter, reaching for his desk phone. "I'll need to contact Internal Affairs," he said, no longer trying to minimize the situation. As she watched him make the call, Michelle reflected on how different this meeting might have gone without the video evidence, without the careful documentation, without the strategic pressure points her brother had helped her identify. The system was designed to discourage complaints, to wear down those who dared to speak up. But she'd come prepared. While Lieutenant Chen spoke in hushed tones on the phone, she sent another text to her brother. "They're calling Aya, just like you predicted." His response came quickly. "Stay strong. Remember, we're just getting started." The wall clock ticked loudly in the silence after Lieutenant Chen hung up. "Someone from Internal Affairs will be here within the hour," he said, shuffling papers on his desk uncomfortably. "You'll need to give them a full statement." "I understand," Michelle replied, settling back in her chair. "I have all day." She thought about the youth center, where her assistant was covering her meetings. About her kids safely at school. About all the people who had faced similar situations without the resources or support she had. This wasn't just about one traffic stop gone wrong. It wasn't even just about Officer Reynolds. It was about challenging a system that too often looked the other way, that dismissed valid complaints, that protected those who abused their power while wearing a badge. As she waited for the Internal Affairs investigator, Michelle reviewed the next steps in her mind. Her brother had already scheduled meetings with civil rights organizations and community leaders. The video footage was secure, backed up in multiple locations. This was just the beginning of a longer fight, one she was fully prepared to see through to the end. 2 weeks after filing her complaint, Michelle sat in her living room surrounded by community members. Her coffee table was buried under stacks of papers, similar complaints against Officer Reynolds, statistics on traffic stops in their neighborhood, and stories from other residents who'd faced harassment but had been afraid to speak up. "I never thought my story would touch so many people," she said, watching as neighbors passed around tablets showing her dashboard camera footage. The video had started circulating in local community groups, catching fire as more people recognized their own experiences in her encounter. Her phone buzzed constantly now with messages from other community organizers, civil rights groups, and local activists. What had started as one woman's stand for justice was turning into something bigger. The Youth Center Kids had even started a social media campaign, sharing tips about knowing your rights and the importance of documentation. "Look at this," said her neighbor, a retired teacher, pointing to a spreadsheet they'd created. "In the past year alone, there have been 50 similar complaints in our district, but only 3 made it past the initial review." She shook her head sadly. "Most people just give up. They think fighting the system is hopeless." Michelle understood that feeling of hopelessness. She'd felt it herself that night, pressed against the police cruiser. But her preparation had made all the difference. Now she was helping others prepare too. Her brother had organized a workshop series on legal rights, teaching community members how to properly document encounters and file complaints. The local news had initially ignored her story, just another claim of police misconduct, they'd said. But the video evidence was too compelling to dismiss. When it finally aired on the evening news, the response was immediate. Phone calls and emails poured in from people across the city sharing similar experiences. "We need to think bigger," suggested a young college student who'd been helping organize their data. "It's not just about one officer or one incident. It's about changing how the whole system works." The room hummed with agreement as people nodded, sharing knowing looks. They'd set up a community support network, making sure no one had to face these situations alone anymore. When someone reported harassment, they had a team ready to respond, people who could document the incident, provide witness statements, and help navigate the complaint process. Michelle's dining room had become an unofficial command center. Every evening, volunteers gathered to review new cases, update their database, and plan their next moves. They'd even created a simple app that helped people record and automatically back up their interactions with law enforcement. The Youth Center teens had surprised everyone with their tech skills, creating social media graphics that spread awareness about citizens' rights. "Knowledge is power," they'd say, echoing Michelle's frequent reminder. Their posts were reaching thousands, teaching people how to protect themselves while staying safe. Local civil rights attorneys had taken notice too. What started as Michelle's single case was expanding into a class action lawsuit. The evidence they'd gathered showed a clear pattern of discriminatory practices, not just by one officer, but throughout the department. "Remember when we thought we were alone in this?" asked an elderly gentleman who'd become a regular at their meetings. "Now look at us. We're making history right here in this living room." His words carried the weight of decades of similar struggles, but now tinged with hope. The movement was growing beyond their neighborhood. Other communities started reaching out, asking for help setting up similar networks. Michelle and her team shared everything they'd learned. Their documentation systems, their organizing strategies, their technical setup for recording incidents. One evening, as Michelle watched volunteers coordinating their efforts across her living room, she thought about how far they'd come. The dashboard camera that had captured her incident had done more than provide evidence. It had sparked a revolution in how their community dealt with injustice. "We've got 3 new cases this week," announced a volunteer, updating their tracking board. But this time, everyone had their phones ready. Everyone knew their rights. Everyone had backup. There was pride in her voice, pride in being part of something bigger than themselves. The police department was starting to feel the pressure. With every documented incident, every coordinated complaint, every media story, the wall of silence was cracking. Some officers had even started reaching out anonymously, sharing their own concerns about departmental practices. As the evening wound down and people began heading home, Michelle caught snippets of their conversations. They were planning next week's Know Your Rights workshop, organizing a community oversight committee meeting, coordinating legal clinic schedules. What had started as one woman's refusal to accept injustice had grown into a full-fledged movement for change. Her phone lit up with another message, another community asking for help setting up their own monitoring system. Michelle smiled, remembering her brother's words from that night. Sometimes all it takes is one person standing up, showing others it's possible to fight back the right way. She hadn't known then just how right he would be. 3 months after Michelle's traffic stop, the police department's main conference room was packed with people. Community members filled every chair, lined the walls, and spilled out into the hallway. The police chief sat at the head of the table, flanked by city council members and department heads. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "We've reviewed all the evidence," the chief began, his voice carefully neutral. On the screen behind him, statistics and video clips painted a damning picture of departmental misconduct. Michelle's dashboard camera footage had been just the beginning. Once people started coming forward with their own documentation, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Her brother, sitting beside her with his legal pad, squeezed her hand under the table. They'd spent countless hours preparing for this moment, building an ironclad case for reform. The stack of documents in front of them represented hundreds of stories, each one carefully verified and documented. "The department acknowledges that changes need to be made," the chief continued. The admission sent a ripple through the crowd. Even a month ago, such a statement would have seemed impossible. But the evidence was too strong, the public pressure too intense, and the media spotlight too bright to maintain the old stance of denial. The reforms they demanded were substantial. Every patrol car would now be equipped with cameras that couldn't be turned off. Officers would be required to complete extensive de-escalation training with regular refresher courses. A civilian oversight board would have real power to investigate complaints and recommend disciplinary action. "Officer Reynolds has been terminated," the chief announced, reading from his prepared statement. "And we've identified 12 other officers with concerning patterns of behavior who are now under investigation." The room erupted in murmurs. This wasn't just about one bad apple anymore, this was about cleaning up the whole orchard. Michelle thought back to that night on the side of the road, how alone and powerless she'd felt. Now, looking around the room at all the faces of people who'd joined the fight for change, she felt anything but powerless. The youth center teens sat in the back row, laptops open, live tweeting the meeting to their growing following of activists and supporters. The changes weren't just on paper. The department was implementing new technology to track officer behavior patterns. Body camera footage would be randomly reviewed by the Civilian Oversight Board. Anonymous reporting systems were being set up for officers to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. But most importantly, the chief said, looking directly at Michelle, "We're changing how we train our officers. Every new recruit will learn about what happened here. They'll watch the footage, study the complaints, understand how abuse of power destroys community trust." The room fell silent as Michelle stood to address the gathering. Her voice was steady as she spoke about trust, about accountability, about the possibility of real change. She talked about how one small dashboard camera had opened the door to transformation, how documentation had turned fear into power. "This isn't just about punishing bad behavior," she explained. "It's about creating a system that prevents it from happening in the first place." Behind her, the screen showed images from their new training programs, officers and community members working together, learning from each other, building bridges instead of walls. The city council had allocated funds for community policing initiatives. Officers would be required to spend time at neighborhood centers, getting to know the people they served. The youth center where Michelle worked was already hosting weekly meetings between teens and police cadets, breaking down barriers and building understanding. As the meeting continued, Michelle's phone quietly buzzed with messages from other cities. Their story had spread, inspiring similar movements across the country. Other communities were using their documentation methods, copying their training programs, following their blueprint for change. The youngest city council member stood up to speak about the new accountability measures. Every traffic stop would now be reviewed for potential bias. Officers with multiple complaints would face automatic investigation. The department's disciplinary records would be publicly accessible, ensuring transparency at every level. Looking around the room, Michelle saw hope on faces that had once shown only fear and resignation. The retired teacher who'd helped compile their database was nodding in satisfaction. The college students who'd built their tracking app were already planning updates to include the new reporting requirements. "This is just the beginning," her brother whispered as the chief signed the official reform documents. "What you started here is going to spread." Michelle knew he was right. Already, police departments in neighboring cities were reaching out, asking to learn from their experience. The meeting ended with a standing ovation, not for any one person, but for the power of community action. As people filed out of the room, Michelle overheard snippets of conversation about next steps, about keeping the momentum going, about ensuring these changes stuck. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from a community organization in a different state, asking for help setting up their own accountability system. The ripples of change were spreading, turning into waves. What had started as one woman's stand against injustice had become a model for transformation. 1 year after the reforms, Michelle stood at the podium in the youth center's main hall, looking out at a room full of eager faces. The Know Your Rights and Responsibilities workshop had become a monthly event, drawing people from all over the state. Today's crowd was a mix of community members, aspiring activists, and even a few police officers who'd chosen to attend on their own time. When I installed that dashboard camera, she began, I never imagined it would lead to all this. The screen behind her showed clips from their successful campaign, community meetings, protest marches, council sessions where they demanded change. But more importantly, it showed what came after: new training programs, community oversight boards, real accountability measures. The nonprofit organization they'd founded, Citizens for Police Accountability and Reform, CPAR, had grown beyond anyone's expectations. What started in Michelle's living room now had offices in 3 cities, with plans to expand further. They provided legal resources, technical support, and training to communities fighting for similar changes across the country. A hand rose from the middle of the room. But how do you keep the momentum going? Asked a woman who'd driven 3 hours to attend. How do you make sure these changes stick? It was a question Michelle had heard many times before, and the answer was always the same. By making it about more than just one incident or one department, she explained. Real change happens when we build systems that work for everyone. She clicked to the next slide, showing their new police community partnership programs. Officers and residents working together on neighborhood projects, youth mentoring programs, joint training sessions. The statistics told a powerful story. Complaints against officers had dropped by 60%. Response times in their neighborhood had improved. More importantly, trust was slowly being rebuilt. The youth center teens who'd once hidden from police cars now participated in monthly basketball games with off-duty officers. Remember this? Michelle played a clip from their first community meeting, where people had been too scared to speak up. Then she showed footage from last week's town hall, where residents and officers engaged in open, honest dialogue about community needs and concerns. Their documentation system had evolved too. The simple dashboard camera that started it all had inspired a comprehensive accountability network. Citizens now had access to secure apps for recording interactions, automatic backup systems, and immediate connections to legal support when needed. But the real success story isn't in the numbers, Michelle continued, switching to images of their youth leadership program. It's in how we've changed the conversation. The screen showed teenagers teaching elderly residents how to use the new reporting apps, community members conducting Know Your Rights workshops, former opponents working together on new initiatives. The back door opened quietly as her brother slipped in. He'd just returned from helping another city set up their own civilian oversight board using the model they'd developed. Their approach was being studied by police departments and activist groups across the country, proving that change was possible when communities worked together. We didn't just fix a broken system, she explained, showing before and after training videos from the police academy. We built a new one. The new training protocols they'd helped develop were now mandatory for every officer. De-escalation techniques, implicit bias awareness, community engagement skills, lessons learned from their own experience. A rookie officer raised his hand. I joined the force because of your story, he shared. The new training programs showed me how to be the kind of officer our community needs. His words reflected a growing trend. People inspired by their success were choosing to work for change from within the system. Michelle clicked to a map showing all the cities that had adopted their reforms. Red dots marked successful civilian oversight boards, blue ones showed departments using their training programs, green highlighted communities with active accountability networks. The map was getting more colorful every month. But our work isn't finished, she said, bringing up their plans for the coming year. New initiatives focused on mental health response teams, expanded youth programs, additional community policing projects. Each one built on what they'd learned, adapted to meet new challenges. The Youth Center teens had taken ownership of the technology side, constantly improving their apps and systems. They'd even developed a nationwide database tracking police accountability measures, helping other communities learn from successful reforms. As the workshop wrapped up, people lingered to share stories and exchange contact information. Michelle watched a grandmother teaching a young activist how to document incidents properly, while a police sergeant discussed community engagement strategies with a group of residents. Her phone buzzed with a message from another city requesting help with their reform efforts. On her laptop, the dashboard showed their latest statistics: incidents documented, complaints resolved, reforms implemented. But the real measure of their success was in the room around her, people from all walks of life working together for positive change. "This is what victory looks like," her brother said, joining her at the podium. "Not just changing laws, but changing hearts and minds." Michelle nodded, remembering that night on the side of the road. One person's stand for justice had sparked a movement, but it was the community coming together that turned that spark into lasting change.